Hi everyone, and welcome to Ask Wardee. This is the weekly show where I answer your questions about traditional cooking. Today we're talking about carbs in different foods, grains, beans, dairy, and whether or not using the traditional methods of sprouting, culturing, or sourdough/fermenting can reduce the carb load. The reason is because one of the most effective ways to lose weight and also manage other things really is to reduce excess sugars in the diet. And foods like grains, beans, and dairy have carbs. And carbs are sugars. There may not be the sugar that you think of, but they are the starches and the sugars within those foods that maybe we're getting too much of. And I'm not trying to call into question all carbs. What I'm trying to suggest though is if you need to lose extra weight, or if you're dealing with diabetes or gut issues, or you're trying to, do a diet plan like Trim Healthy Mama, that reducing those excess carbs may be helpful to help you reach your goals. So that's what we're discussing today. It's a question that came in from Mathew M, who's working on weight loss and building up health and immune system in him and his family. He says, I've been a member for close to a year. I have a couple questions. I'm trying to bring down my weight and at the same time improve my health and immunity, actually for all my family, which I love. We're all trying to do that. One way I'm trying to do it is to reduce my carb intake. When sourdough is made from spelt or einkorn or sprouted wheat, are the anti-nutrients, gluten, carbs, and sugar reduced too? Does kefir made from grass-fed raw A2 milk contain carbs or sugar? Does sprouting eliminate carbs and anti-nutrients from legumes or lentils or beans? Great question, Matthew. There's a lot of information in there, so we're going to unpack it. My main answer, my bottom line for you right now is it depends. And I just can't say we're going to unpack that, but it really does depend because you've brought in a lot of issues with gluten and carbs and the different types of foods. And so it has to depend because we're talking about different methods also. We're talking about sourdough or sprouting or culturing. We're talking about the different foods, so it really does depend. All of the foods, though, that you're talking about, the grains, the legumes/beans, the dairy, they do all have carbs in the form of sugars. So in the grains and beans, it's the starches and the complex carbohydrates. In the dairy, it would be lactose, which is milk sugar. So all of them have carbs. And so you're right, if you're trying to lose weight and you're getting too many of those, that it could be a good idea to reduce it. Of course, I'm not making a recommendation and everybody's slightly different. The diet plan that I follow using traditional foods, Trim Healthy Mama, I eat a limited amount of these carbohydrates. I don't ever go overboard, but I eat some of them. So within everybody's sort of plan that they're working on for improving gut health or managing diabetes or losing weight, it could be that you have some, it could be that you have none, and I'll leave that up to you. We're going to talk today, Matthew, about the issue of do the traditional methods have an effect on carbs, okay? So I want to break it down now because sprouting and souring/fermenting/culturing, they can reduce the carbs in foods if the temperature's warm enough, if it's done long enough. And we're going to go through the different food groups and I'll give you more specifics, okay? So first we're going to start with the sprouting and souring of grains and beans. So examples would be like this is our sourdough bread. This is our no-knead einkorn sourdough bread, and I do have a recipe linked for you at askwardee.tv or look below this video if you want this free recipe. It's a no-knead, and a lot of times I make it in an artisan loaf, but I also make it in loaf pans too, like this, so we have really soft, wonderful sliced bread. So you can take your grains like einkorn, which is an ancient variety of wheat, or your spelt, or your wheat, and you can use sourdough to turn it into bread. You can also take your beans and grains, and I have an example here of einkorn berries. These are the grains of einkorn. And you can sprout these as well, and you could turn them into flour and then turn them into bread and combine with sourdough, so you have a lot of options, but that's what we're talking about. So I want to talk about these two particular methods. Now, traditional food prep methods, if you say them in order, you say soak, then sprout, then ferment. Ferment can also be called culturing. It can also be called sourdough if you're talking about grains, okay? They're in order of effectiveness. And I'm not going to talk about soaking today because soaking, to my knowledge, doesn't really have an effect on carb reduction. So we're going to focus on sprouting, and we're going to focus on sourdough / culturing / fermenting. And when you're talking about grains, and we're going to talk about besides soaking, we're going to focus on sprouting right now. So sprouting is where you take your berries, which are, beans or grains. I lost that one. You take it, and by introducing warmth and water, so you're kind of like mimicking what would happen in the soil, you're converting it from its storage dry state as a seed, if you will, into a young plant. And that conversion means that the bound up carbohydrates that are stored in this seed become food for the young plant that's going to grow out of this. So during that conversion, the more complex starches or whatever, if you will, that are in here, the sugars are going to become food for the plant. So the longer that process goes, the more of them are consumed by the seedling that grows out of them, if that makes sense. Okay? The stored starches are becoming food for the young plant, and so yes, the carbs are reduced. When you're souring grains, which is like you're making sourdough bread like this, you're combining your flour, so you're grinding up your seeds, which may be sprouted. You're grinding them up into a flour, and you're combining them with a sourdough starter. A sourdough starter is a batter of flour and water that has been cultured and nurtured over time to make it a thriving ecosystem of beneficial bacteria and yeast. And these get combined with your flour, and you allow your dough to sour for a certain amount of time. A minimum would be 5 to 6 hours, but I heard from a lady the other day who's making this no-knead bread, and she's souring it for 36 hours. So you can go a long time. And during the souring time, the organisms that are in this starter eat the starches and the sugars that are in the flour, therefore reducing the carbs. Make sense, everyone? So in the case of sprouting, it's really a function of how far the seed goes to the young plant, how much is converted into or getting consumed by the young plant. And in sourdough bread, it's a function of the warmth and the amount of time that the starter's organisms are with the flour to eat the sugars. So in both cases, there is a reduction of carbs because the organisms are eating it in the case of sourdough, the young plant is eating it in the case of a sprouted seed. And this applies to beans as well, because you can grind beans into flour and ferment it and sour it in dough. You can sprout beans, and the same kind of thing happens. Okay, and you can combine, like I said. So you can take sprouted grains, you can grind them and dry them, grind them into flour, and then use them in a dough that's soured with a sourdough starter. Isn't that cool? I mean, there's just so many different ways you can take this. But the bottom line is you will get a reduction in carbs by sprouting or sourdough. How much? Going to get to that in a bit because may not have a perfect answer for you. And as a reminder, my free no-knead bread recipe is linked with this video, or you can go to askwardee.tv, look for this episode 95 to find a link. If you're on Facebook, Millie's pasting it there in the comments. Okay, now what about dairy? So there's no sprouting of dairy, and so we're just going to be talking culturing, which, like sourdough, there's organisms that do the work. So if you're making yogurt or you're making kefir or you're making cheese, you're introducing a culture, which are beneficial organisms, and they are consuming the milk sugar as their food source. So whereas sourdough bread, you have the sourdough starters organisms eating the starches and sugars. In culturing dairy, you're taking milk, introducing a culture, and the organisms in that culture are consuming the milk sugar, okay? So, I mean, souring, whether it's sour dairy or whether it's sourdough bread, very similar in terms of that process. And again, remember when I was telling you about sourdough, that the starter combined with the flour, how warm it is, the longer and the warmer, the more reduction in carbs you have. The same thing is pretty much true of culturing dairy. So depending on the temperature that the organisms feel is ideal, the longer they're at that ideal temperature, the more milk sugar that they're going to consume. When I make yogurt, which I've got a free yogurt recipe linked for you with this video, it's a thick raw milk yogurt recipe. You can preserve the nutritious and beneficial properties of your raw milk and turn it into yogurt. Side note, often yogurt recipes have you pasteurizing the milk. So if you start with raw, you pasteurize it, then you culture it. Well, in my recipe, you don't have to pasteurize. You can take your raw milk and keep its properties and still make yogurt. So I've got that recipe for you at askwardee.tv. But with yogurt or kefir, those kind of cultures, what I do for me is follow this general rule that I would like it to ferment at its ideal temperatures for 24 hours or more. So that's kind of a general rule, and there may be variances, but with those kind of cultures, if you ferment your dairy for 24 hours or more, you're going to get a maximum reduction of lactose. So it's pretty cool. So when I make yogurt or kefir, I do make sure to ferment that long, and then we end up with a basically sugar-free. There's no lactose left, or if any, there's very little. So it's a carb-free food. Whereas with the grains and the beans, this is still bread, okay? It's not carb-free. But the dairy, if you ferment long enough, it will be lactose-free or fully lactose reduced because the organisms have eaten it all, so you will have basically a carb-free food. So it's really a beautiful thing. So grab the free thick raw milk yogurt recipe. Also at the show notes, I have a link to my kefir recipe, which this is actually kefir. And kefir, we tend to ferment 48 to 72 hours. So 2 to 3 days is how long I ferment the kefir. When you're talking about cheeses and such, like there's spontaneously soured raw milk that you can turn into a clabber cheese. Again, 24 hours or more is great, but there's hard cheeses where you're like culturing the milk for just an hour and then cutting it into curds and then forming it into blocks and pressing it. Well, that hour is not long enough to reduce the lactose. So I don't know that I have specific data for you on how long it takes, but I do know that there's certain recommendations, like if you're on a gut healing diet, that you want to look for cheeses that are aged more than 60 days. So, with cheeses, 60 days is kind of the rule I follow. And that's the information I have on that. Matthew, you did mention the A2 issue, and in your question, you said your grass-fed A2 milk. So I just want to address that by saying that the A2 issue, for everybody who's wondering, has to do with the genetic property of the milk protein. And A2 would be the heritage breed. And if it's a non-A2 cow or whatever, that means there's a genetic mutation that affects the milk protein. So it's really not relevant to our discussion of carbs here, but A2 is to be preferred milk. And you'll find it generally with heritage breeds of cows, but there is genetic testing that a lot of dairies do because maybe you have a Jersey cow or a Jersey cross that is no longer A2 anymore. So it does have to be confirmed with genetic testing. I have an article for you at the show notes if you're interested in that. I'm not going to go into it more, but I did want to address it at least briefly because that was your question, Matthew. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up by saying that everything we've been talking about today here, reducing carbs, where you're dealing with breads, where you're or beans, or you're dealing with dairy, it works really well with Trim Healthy Mama. And as you may know, a couple years ago, I was able to lose more than 30 pounds in a year by combining the traditional foods we love with the principles of Trim Healthy Mama, which means eating the carbs and protein together without fat in meals or snacks, spaced like 2.5 hours apart from meals and snacks that are protein fat. So the fat and the carbs are really never eaten together because they're fuel sources. And if you eat too much of it at one sitting, you can store it as fat in your body. So it's very helpful to lose weight. So that's my quick Trim Healthy Mama story. And I use these kind of foods a lot to maintain, even today, to eat that way with the traditional foods I love. So for instance, our no-knead bread has no added fat, and the sourdough has, helped a lot to reduce the carbs. So this is a very reasonably carbed bread to eat in a carb setting, or you call it an E setting. It still is a carb, but it's been reduced through sourdough, so it's not a heavy carb. The kefir and yogurt that we do, we start with raw milk, culture it, skim the cream away, and I would make butter with it. I would use it as sour cream. Because it's fermented for 24 to 48 hours, it's had a maximum reduction in lactose, so it has no carbs. So this makes it ideal to use in E settings, which are protein and carb. because it brings no carbs to the table, so you could put it in a carb food where there's no fat, or you can use it as what's called a fuel pull because it's just protein. Again, the cream has been skimmed, the lactose has been reduced, or this can be used in an S setting because all it is protein at this point, so you can add fat and then it would be a protein fat setting, okay? I cannot adequately explain this whole thing, so at the show notes you'll see a link to the brand new Trim Healthy Mama. It's called Trim Healthy Table Cookbook that has an explanation, a really good explanation of the plan at the beginning and some wonderful new recipes. Additionally, I have a 1-week menu plan that combines, if you can see a picture of it there, it combines the traditional foods that I love to eat in a menu plan where you can follow like the S and E meals, etc. So there's breakfast, lunches, dinners, desserts, and snacks for a whole week that are Trim Healthy Mama with traditional foods. You'd call it Purist, and you'll find a link to that with this recording as well. Okay? I've also got articles for you if you do want more information on my journey, like, you know, the top traditional foods I ate, the lessons I learned, how exactly I did it, a little bit more about the plan. But I love, Matthew, your question today because it's a really good one, and actually it comes up a lot because traditional methods can have an impact on the foods we eat. It makes them more nutritious and digestible in the sense that you're deactivating the phytic acid that can inhibit mineral absorption. You can neutralize enzyme inhibitors that interfere with digestion. You can pre-digest gluten, and as we're talking about today, gluten is the protein. As we're talking about today, you can also reduce carbs. In the case of your breads and beans, your grains, you'll get somewhat reduction, but you're really, you can't go totally carb-free on those. So there's a reduction, but not a total reduction. On the dairy, it really depends on the amount of time. And if you do your kefir and yogurt for 24 hours at least, you can reduce the carbs nearly all the way, or 60 days for your aged cheeses. So you've got some really, really good options here, Matthew. And I hope that this has been helpful for you and your family as you build up your health and immunity and lose weight. This is always on my mind as well because I had my 30-pound weight loss a couple years ago, and I definitely don't want it back. It's just fantastic to be able to maintain it with these wonderful, beautiful foods and just kind of being smart about how we prepare and combine them. So I really wish you well, and I hope you'll keep in touch about how it goes. As I wrap up here, I just want to let all of you know from my heart, thank you so much for joining Ask Wardee this week. The notes are ready for you at askwardee.tv, so shortly there will be a recording there, but right now you can read along with everything that I've shared, pick up the free menu plan, pick up the no-knead bread recipe, pick up my yogurt recipe. They're all linked there for you, as well as additional reading. Like I do have an article on the glycemic index of sourdough bread. So glycemic index is somewhat related because the glycemic index is a scale of 1 to 100, and foods are ranked with their 1 being a low blood sugar effect, 100 being a high blood sugar effect. And a really quick tidbit is that if you take just regular non-soured bread, it has a high GI index, meaning it has quite a big impact on blood sugar. But if you do true sourdough, like we've got here, then you move that bread from high to low on the GI index. So there's a whole article that explains more about that. Of course, it's still a bread, it's still a carb, but you can just be much more friendly on your blood sugar by using the principles of sourdough. Okay? I look forward to hearing from you all. The comments are open, so continue to add your comments and we will look through them and keep up with them. If you have a question for a future episode of Ask Wardee, I'm all ears, so all the details are at askwardee.tv. Look for this episode 95 for the instructions. And I think that's it. So God bless you all. Thanks so much for being here. Talk to you again in a week. Same time, same place. Bye-bye.